Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church, and along with Pastor Nanette Christofferson, each week we are trying to provide a brief introduction to two of the lectionary readings for the upcoming Sunday. In this video, you will see an introduction to the Gospel for this coming Sunday, August 16th. It is the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 to 28. As we look at any Bible study or Bible passages, Lutherans, it's important for us always to look at the historical and literary context of a particular writing. And in the context and background of this reading, it's important to see that in Matthew 15, verses 1 to 28, which our lesson is a part of, it is a concern being addressed over ritual purity. Jesus is concluding his is close to concluding his 3-year public ministry of preaching, teaching, and healing. And here in chapter 15, there's issues about who's clean and who's not, who's worthy and who's not, who's acceptable and who's not acceptable. Prior to our reading for Sunday, Jesus has just completed teaching the crowd. In Matthew 15:10, he says, "It is not what goes into your mouth that defiles a person. It is what comes out of the mouth that defiles." Hearing these words offend the rule keepers of Jesus' day, the Pharisees. Jesus is pressed by Peter to expound on what he's saying. So Jesus answers, "Do you not see that whatever goes into a mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart." And heart in the Hebrew mind was that center of reason and emotion. It was the Greeks who changed that to the brain. And here Jesus says, "But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. And this is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witnesses, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile." That's found in Matthew 15:16 to 20. So here in our reading for Sunday, Jesus takes his disciples away from the Sea of Galilee, and he's moving them toward the Mediterranean coast to the regions of Tyre and Sidon. I've given you a map in this Bible study so you can see kind of the movement from the Sea of Galilee up to the coastal area. In the ancient Near East, this area was first occupied by the Phoenicians, not to be confused with those who reside in Phoenix, Arizona. The people in this territory worshiped Phoenician gods. They were not Jewish, they were pagans, and by Matthew stating that she was from the region suggests that she was from the rural outlying area. She was a peasant rather than a city dweller. Matthew calls her a Canaanite, which is kind of strange because the Canaanites have not been around for centuries. But he calls her a Canaanite even though that tribe of people had long been extinguished. The title did carry with it a long, long history recorded in the Jewish scriptures of enmity between Jews and the Canaanites. You might recall way back in Genesis 9 that Noah had 3 sons, and Canaan was the grandson of Noah, one of those sons, and it was Canaan's father who saw Noah naked, so he was cursed by Noah, and the curse extended to Canaan. When Joshua led the people of Israel in the promised land, it was the Canaanites who were destroyed. It was the Canaanites who were displaced. There was a long history of bad blood between the Jews and the Canaanites. So Matthew obviously is trying to make a point by saying that this woman was a Canaanite. So why would this woman approach Jesus? Think about your own journey with Jesus. When have you found yourself desperate to try and do anything to help someone you love? Imagine being a woman in the time of Jesus. You are poor, you come from a rural area, you're uneducated, and you're a mother. You might imagine the journey of pregnancy this woman had, whether planned or not. Pregnancy is filled with waiting, expectation, anxiety, fear, and excitement. When birth happens, the protective maternal nature kicks into high gear. There's joy over the health and development of this woman's little girl. I can imagine in Jesus' day, her teaching her the responsibilities of being a woman in society, teaching her the domestic chores and training that would be necessary. But then illness hits. In Jesus' day, life expectancy was only 26 years. Death and disease were often layered with spiritual causes. God or the gods punishing the individual or the family tree for some offense were often the reason given. In this story, the daughter suffers from seizures, and with no understanding of the brain or having MRIs or CAT scans available, the simple diagnosis in Matthew's account is she's demon-possessed. This woman is not a Jew. She's not from the tribes of Israel. It appears in the eyes of both Jesus and the disciples, she's not a priority in the mission or ministry to which they have been called. Jesus simply ignores her pleas and does not even answer her as she cries at him. The disciples come to Jesus and urge him to send her away. Then Jesus makes a statement in verse 24. I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. When have you experienced an interruption or disruption of your work, your plans, or your project? How did you respond? How did you discover that the interruption or disruption may actually have been the person or situation you really needed to address? The Canaanite woman persists. Lord, help me. Then Jesus responds in verse 26 in a way that probably shocks our modern ears. It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. The word fair can imply morally right. So Jesus may be framing his response here to imply that it's not morally right for the king of the Jews to help this Canaanite woman. But that does not excuse Jesus calling this woman or implying that this woman is a dog, which when translated, that word was a name of contempt. Surprisingly, in this exchange, the woman agrees with Jesus that he has no moral right to give that which is intended for the children to the dogs. And she even says, you can call me a dog, but in verse 27, she responds, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. This woman reflects back to Jesus that I am no better than a dog. But even the dogs get better treatment than you're giving me. Can't you spare a few crumbs? A few crumbs of grace, mercy, or compassion? We shift from last week's gospel reading of Peter sinking into the sea and Jesus telling him and the disciples about how little faith they have, to Jesus in this reading along the coast with a Canaanite woman saying in verse 28, woman, great is your faith. I can picture the disciples hearing this praise of this Canaanite woman's faith, knowing full well how many times Jesus has told them how little their faith is. This woman came to Jesus with nothing. She was poor. She was a pagan. Her faith was not rooted or centered in the God of Israel. Yet still more than the disciples, she was willing to put her absolute faith and trust in him to do what no one else was able to do. for her daughter. What makes a person unclean comes from within, not from without. The woman's faith came from within her. She had none of the trappings, the credentials, the qualifications, or resume expected of the praise that Jesus gave her. Matthew may be intentional about putting before his audience the tension we all know between using pronouns like we versus them, or inside and outside, or worthy and unworthy. He may also be helping the church be aware of our own tendencies for placing our traditions or our interpretations ahead of God's ultimate word and God's ultimate will. When reading this story, how do you see Jesus overcoming the ethnic, cultural, political, gender, and religious barriers human beings for centuries have always tried to create? How have you experienced overcoming similar barriers? May God bless you as you meditate on God's word this week. Take care.